the first hour. And please, as a reminder, to mute when you're not speaking. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the Huron team, who I know has a number of things to review with us this morning, updated stakeholder input and some other stuff. So with that, Peter, I'll turn it over to you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be with you here today. And so if we could just pull some slides up on our end, I can get us started on the journey that we're going to take here this morning. And so there are a few things that we do want to accomplish. One of those is to discuss some of the emerging themes from our stakeholder engagement effort. I do want to underscore that that effort is still in process. And so the emerging themes that we'll discuss today are certainly preliminary. This process is also intended to be iterative and recursive. So the conversations that we're having with stakeholders are in no way intended to be of a one and done variety. We want to focus this effort that we're engaged in now on ideation and generative thinking in a creative fashion. Later, we'll have further engagement with everyone where we start thinking about prioritization and specific initiatives that could advance those priorities. So at this stage, we're still relatively early days, some very interesting themes emerging, and certainly a fair bit of pattern recognition that I think will be familiar to many of you. But again, I just want to emphasize that we're preliminary in that regard. We're also going to pick up on our discussion from March about the importance of creating a shared understanding of the current environment and the state of play for the UMS community. And so we're going to review some of the implications that are in effect implied in the data that we've gathered as part of the data book effort. And then, of course, we'll close with a brief discussion of next steps. I also, though, just wanted to connect today's discussion to our prior discussion. And so if we could just look at the next slide. In March, we also looked at some specific enrollment strategies, and that was informed by a discussion with some of our Huron colleagues, Steve Hahn and Rob Bilby. And that led to a discussion that encompassed a few key issues. And so, for example, we talked about community college transfer, as well as the extent to which the community college system represents a kind of competitor for the University of Maine system, particularly given the near-term horizon of free community college. We also talked about taking a system approach to workforce development and coordinating activity across and between universities in the system. This is an issue that has certainly come up in many of our visits to each university and in our diverse conversations, both in person and online. We also talked a little bit about achieving a contemporary and market responsive approach to diverse delivery models, including online and hybrid. And again, this is something that we have also had some discussion about with some of the universities that we've been visiting, and in fact, have had a conversation this morning with the cabinet at Augusta that was, I think, productive in that regard. We've also, of course, been seeking to avoid an approach to strategic planning that would effectively look at sort of averaging out the differences between all of the universities in the system. We want to avoid anything that would take us in the direction of homogenization. That's not the intention. Instead, we want to focus on the unique locations, assets, and capabilities of each university, as well as the most promising points of collaboration and where coordination can produce efficiencies. And in that regard, we also want to hypothesize what an evolved system model might look like, one that brings greater complementarity and coordination to the participating universities. And then finally, we've talked about engaging with external stakeholders in a more coordinated way to aided, I suppose, by a more consistent set of messages about the value of UMS so that we can achieve, I think, greater alignment with the needs of the state and the various communities in the state with regard to the education and training needs to support economic development. So all of those themes have surfaced in one or more of our stakeholder dialogues, and I think that just underscores the relevance of all these issues. So I suspect we'll be returning to some of these. But with that as just a bit of opening framing, I'll hand it off to Brennan. Brennan's going to talk a little bit about some calendar items so that we're all aware where we are in the near term, as well as some stakeholder engagement themes and some of the typical components of a strategic plan. So Brennan, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Peter. And we just thought we'd briefly share the timeline. This was listed in the document as our third topic, but because our conversation becomes so robust at the end and we want to continue the dialogue from the second topic in the executive session, we thought we'd preview these items related to the timeline just very briefly. So as Peter mentioned, we are accompanying the Chancellor on the spring visits to each campus this month. We are actually on site today at Augusta. And you may have noticed that our May meeting for the board ad hoc committee was moved to the third week of May. It's actually going to be on the Friday before the full board meeting on Monday, May 23rd. And the hope with that is that we could actually preview with you all what we plan to present to the full board on the next Monday. I know that just the Friday before doesn't give us a ton of time, but we wanted to make sure that this committee was sort of socialized with the full board report that we're preparing before we get to the full board, and we could gather your input at that time in terms of how we present it. And the content for that full board meeting is going to consist of our themes to date that seek to marry our stakeholder engagement themes, which you will see an early version of that in just a second, as well as the implications from the data book. And then the second topic for that full board meeting report is going to be an early alignment between the unified accreditation process and the strategic planning process. And then as we move forward into the summer, we do plan to schedule a prioritization workshop. So you all will all know that at this point, we have been surfacing opportunities and both from a quantitative and a qualitative lens. And as we move towards the summer, we are going to really value your help in beginning to prioritize. So with that, we will move on to the emerging stakeholder engagement themes. As Peter mentioned, the document that we're going to go through is sort of the emerging themes, and it really consists of the themes that we've gathered from the virtual stakeholder engagement. So we conducted a virtual cabinet meeting and a virtual interview with each president, as well as a few focus groups with different clusters of system leadership. And then the campus visit themes, we will be pulling all of that together in the next iteration of the themes that you will see. And we do have one slide here where we have gathered some themes from our visit to the Maine School of Law and our Farmington visit, which were completed at the time of the production of this document. And so just to give you a little bit of a view of sort of where we're headed with these themes, this is a representative strategic planning taxonomy. So this is how the themes that we are gathering will at some point be categorized into one of these sort of buckets. So mission, vision, values are pretty self-explanatory. When we get to the vertical strategic priorities and the horizontal strategic priorities, these may be items that you'll see in these strategic priority themes that we'll go over in just a second. Vertical strategic priorities could be something like affordability. It could be something like academic excellence. It could be something like innovation. Whereas a horizontal strategic priority could be something like diversity, equity, and inclusion, which might span throughout the vertical strategic priorities. And then you'll see initiatives will be things like what existing initiatives could be expanded or what new initiatives could be implemented to really bring some action to some of these higher level focus areas or priorities. And then measures, how will we know we're successful, and enablers, what resources will we need to support implementation. So you'll hear a lot more about this as we continue through the process, but thought we could just give you this to have in the back of your mind as we're going through the themes. And so Kate is going to now walk us through the themes that we have put together. They are falling into 4 different categories at the moment: strengths, challenges, strategic priorities, and role of the system office. So Kate, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Brenna. And so, as you've had a little bit of time with materials before the meeting, I won't belabor any of the points here, but what I'd like to do is really walk through the set of information that are depicted on the slides, and then stop to ask questions once we walk through all of them together. So first, really, when we have these conversations virtually, what we noticed is that there are a number of strengths within the system, right? There are a lot of great assets that the system has to leverage, and that could be leveraged, to a greater point. I think that one of the first ones that consistently comes up in conversations is really the state of Maine itself. The universities within the state are embedded in a number of different communities that offer a wide range of, experiential learning or opportunities for research. And there are different markets within the state as well. There's opportunities within rural communities, but also within larger markets like Portland or Orono, where there is a lot of different commerce or other opportunities for students. So in of itself, Maine is a fantastic place to leverage. And the other piece that we've heard as well is that, for talent, it can be really attractive as a place to raise a family or build a life as well. So I think, from a strengths perspective, that really came through fairly consistently. And related to that, there is the significant connectedness. And the quote that we always like to kind of surface in this conversation is that someone during the course of our meeting said, this is the smallest big pond you'll ever be a part of. And I think what that really speaks to is that there are a lot of opportunities for, a student or a faculty member or a staff member to connect, with someone in the legislature for an opportunity, or in another community to elevate an experience that they might not have, at another institution or in a different market that might be larger. So for students here, there's a lot of opportunity, based on not only relationships, but kind of proximity to different levels of experiences within this state. And very consistently, we hear that an education at UMaine in the system is affordable. A lot of students said, I wouldn't be able to go to college, or students wouldn't have this opportunity if it weren't for the fact that this education is so affordable for me, and for that I'm grateful. So I think on those strengths, those were really key as what emerged there. Brenna, would you like to go to the next slide? The next piece, one that consistently came up as well was the R1 designation. And not only that it benefits Orono, but that it benefits the entire system, because there are a lot of unique research projects that can be taken advantage of, whether it's on Orono's campus or throughout the system as well. And Orono has the ability to support another of other campuses, through that R1 designation and the structure of having that R1 kind of complex centralized on one campus. And so it brings a lot of not only notoriety, but a lot of opportunities as well to build workforce and to build economic development, through some of those means through that designation as well. The other piece that really ties to kind of the state of Maine and some of the interconnectedness as well is that really each of these universities where they're situated are economic and cultural drivers. I know that Emily mentioned in a previous conversation many months ago, wanting us to talk about or see if we can learn or understand not only what the economic impact is, but what's the cultural impact? What are institutions really bringing to communities? And we're finding that there are ways for folks to have really strong connections, not only to educational opportunities and having, access to jobs, as it might be one of the 3 largest employers in an area, but it also brings cultural events and a really strong cultural impact, so that folks are exposed to, a number of different opportunities where they have opportunities for learning, or again, to, go to a theater or experience some kind of performance or something like that. So we know that they are strong anchors within their communities as well. And that they're always, not always, pardon me, there are a number of collaborations that exist currently that I think are scalable. So we've heard from a lot of folks that there are either academic programs like a cybersecurity program between 2 campuses, or a 2+2 program in nursing between 2 campuses as well. that could be offered more broadly, or that can be leveraged as a really good blueprint to elevate to other campuses as well. And that some that are really unique, like the Rural Practice Clinic, that not only Maine could be a leader in, and can be an example to other states who are also kind of working in these areas as well. Next slide, Brenna. And then for challenges, we find, like every family has its own set of challenges as well. And so one of the key ones that really emerged in these conversations was really the scale and the scope of the system. It's a really, broad in terms of size, but it's also broad in terms of where the institutions are situated and who they offer, who their audiences are, right? There are different student profiles that access each campus differently. And so that's among one of the things that the strategic plan will need to reconcile with is understanding how to meet different audiences, where their needs are and how each institution can meet those needs as well. And again, kind of tying to financial sustainability, the scale and scope of some of the aging infrastructure on each of the different campuses, and making sure that each institution and the system as well is financially healthy moving forward, and thinking about ways to embed financial sustainability, from now into many years in the future, knowing that the University of Maine system is such an important economic driver, but also, right, you're a workforce driver, you're economic driver. It's a really important piece of the state itself. And so ensuring that the institutions are fiscally supported moving forward is going to be incredibly important. And the other thing I want to make sure that we elevate really is this piece on kind of internal and external competition. So there have been, commentary on there are tensions in between, kind of resource allocation, how the budget model interplays with that. I think some historical pains from growth or resources in the past. So that will be another piece to reconcile moving forward, whether that's through a change management process. But know that there are some existing tensions that definitely emerge as we were having conversations that will need to be addressed moving forward. And then on the next slide, I feel like we've talked about demographic declines quite often, so I feel like that's kind of non sequitur at this point. The other piece too that we're seeing is some structural tension, one about kind of the role of the campus versus the role of the system, right? And who and where does autonomy sit on either of the campuses? And so I think there are a couple of different desires from institutions. Some say we'd really like to figure it out ourselves and be nimble and really have the autonomy to follow the plan. Others say we'd really like the system and the board to tell us what to do, and we'll execute the plan as well. So I think there's a tension there that will need to be explored and really understood in order to move the entire system forward. And with a number of those items, right, communications and trust has come up, really that there needs to be a really strong level of continued transparency and integrative decision making where folks feel like they are able to participate and have an equal voice. I think that was really important as something that emerged, is that folks want to. There was a great quote where someone said, "I really hope moving forward this is more like the Senate rather than the House of Representatives in terms of being equally heard in conversations moving forward." So then on the next page, we have a set of strategic priorities. And again, these are some of the areas that we have heard about. None of these are certainly codified or firm at all. But we see that there are a couple of areas that really tie to both those strengths and challenges. So I think research and economic development, really came forward as something that's important, knowing the role that the system plays in the state and the ability it has to bring, new economic opportunities to the state and really provide the workforce for the state as well. Retention, persistence, and completion has come up in pretty much every single conversation, knowing that with a declining demographic, it will be ever more important to maintain the students that you have in the system and make sure that they are successful moving through as well. And the adult market as well comes up. There are a number of adults who might be being downsized, or there are opportunity within other markets in the state that I think the institution or the system itself might have the opportunity to tap into. So folks are really talking about the idea that there are some opportunities where UMaine can really play a strong, or the University of Maine system can play a strong role in having continued partnerships with local businesses within the state as well. Next slide. And then finally, again, some of these are, I think there was someone who said some of these priorities, there's kind of an arrow that draws through, right, the priorities back to the strengths and the challenges. I think here, again, a lot of stakeholders mentioned that, we need to be able to leverage the assets of Maine, while we think about how we innovate with those, right? Can we create some academic innovations around how we deliver, coursework or degrees? Can we do it in shorter terms? How can it be more accessible for students? What is our ability to be adaptable given the different student or learner profiles that each of the universities will need to meet, market to, or work with within kind of those local communities as well. Next slide. And then finally, one of the bigger conversations that has emerged is really understanding what the role of the system office is, and what the role of the entire system of is. And so I think there is a point where we will have a future conversation where we'll dedicate some time to understanding what exactly is the role of the system office, what are their responsibilities, how do we define the system versus the system office differently, and what should those objectives or priorities be that sit within the system or system office versus what should sit with the campuses. So now racing through that, thank you very much for holding on tight. Brenna, would you like me to do campus feedback as well?
We could move on to discussion questions. I know we do want to save time for our second topic as well. So we are going to shoot to be wrapping up this conversation at about 10:35. And so maybe I will just pose two questions related to the themes. The first and the second one, I think we want to spend time on this question number 5, because Jim, Erwin, I know that you had a special agenda topic where you wanted to spend some time discussing this. So we'll get to that question number 5. But first, just two follow-ups related to the themes that Kate just presented. One, was there anything that surprised you that she discussed? And then 2, was there anything that surprised you that was not brought up in our stakeholder conversations?
I had a question on the challenges piece where there's a reference to perceptions of external stakeholders, and wondering at what point we engage those external stakeholders so we hear from them directly, which I think we need to do both for the plan and for the sort of small p politics to get buy-in into this work from the people we are that are so important to us, like legislators and business community.
Most definitely, yep. And the external stakeholder engagement is something that we are actively working through with Jim in terms of Jim and the Chancellor in terms of when we are actually going to conduct those conversations. And I think we're shooting for next month.
Okay, thanks.
Brenna?
Yes, Roger, please.
Roger, thank you. First of all, I just want to say that we all have a goal of learning something new every day. And on page 8, I never heard the word taxonomy before. I had to look up what it meant. So I've learned something new today. That's great. I was a little surprised by a deletion. There's talk here about how we want to increase the number of community college students who then go on to matriculate at one of our universities, and that's really important. But I think once you start hearing from stakeholders, and particularly legislators, you're going to want to hear less about competition between us and the community college system and more about coordination. And the theme of how can we work better with the community college system to make sure that the scarce state resources are being used in the best possible way, so we're not duplicating things, but rather we're complementing each other. I don't see that anywhere, and at least for me, I think that's an important consideration. And I'm not suggesting there is a lot of necessary duplication of programs, but to the extent there is, and to the extent we can continue the trajectory of the last several years in improving cooperation between the two systems, that's a good thing. The only other point I'd make is with the external stakeholders, and I know I assume you're already doing this, and I think you said you are, but members of legislative leadership and particularly leadership on the education committee, I think would be really helpful to see their view of the university system and what kinds of things they're looking for. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And on the community college front, I know we had a conversation about that last time, and there was a request to do some additional research. And we did do some additional research on community colleges and added that to the data book. So when we move on to the second topic, we do have some data points and a discussion question related to engagement with community college leadership in the state of Maine as well.
Thanks.
Any other thoughts on themes that surprised you, or themes that were not brought up in our conversations and therefore we did not capture, things that are missing, that are surprising that they aren't
I had one observation that struck me, which was in the strengths. I really didn't see much about how strong any of our programs are. There's mention of some programs, but it's more in terms of how they may work together collaboratively, but not how well they drive the Maine economy and how well they prepare the future workforce, which was a surprise. And at one level, it's a surprise. If we were really good at what we did, we would expect to see that. So I think there's both a reality and a perception problem there for us, which leads me to a second point. I was surprised that there wasn't more recognition of kind of our marketing challenges. There's a lot of our story that's good that isn't really well known, and it's difficult to market because campuses tend to be in competition with each other. It's hard to market a system versus a campus, et cetera, et cetera. But I think going forward, a coordinated and coherent marketing effort is going to be critical to the system. And marketing isn't just advertising. I mean, it's external stakeholder engagement. It's all of those things. But I would just note those two things seem to me to be kind of underrepresented.
Yeah. Absolutely agree about the storytelling of the University of Maine system and how it adds value to students and the state. That is something that people brought up as a challenge here in the UMS brand, but I definitely think it could be represented as a priority moving forward as well. So thanks for that, Chip.
I'll just build on that a little bit, which is I was actually struck by, in a lot of ways, how there did seem to be clarity around what people need from the system, right? In the way of the collaboration, the shared resources, the advocacy, right? The sort of statewide piece. But there was also a very clear message to me about the importance of each campus, right? That the system doesn't replace that. The system has an important role to play to support the campuses. But I was really struck by how the things that come across as assets were very much more campus-based than system-based, the way I read this. And I'm actually really interested to go through the campus feedback, because I also wonder, looking at the people who were interviewed, because Jim, I had the similar perspective of you on, like, why aren't we talking about the strength of our programs? And I kind of wonder if maybe we were asking the wrong people, right? If we if when we get to asking the employers in the state, I hope that they'll say the engineering program or the nursing program or the teaching, the teacher education program has made all the difference. But we haven't asked those questions yet. And so I'm hoping that pops up in the next round of feedback.
Were any of you surprised that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, didn't come across as a big theme?
Honestly, no, I was not. I think it should be a theme, and I think as a board, we're going to have to make it a theme, but I'm not surprised.
No, I'm sadly not either. And I think it reflects the nature of our state, that it's still a pretty white state, and that the priority, it just doesn't surface as a priority, and we need to think about how to do that.
We'll say that for the students at our Orono meeting, it was a very important issue. We had about 25 students at the University of Maine, and then at Southern Maine, we only had 2 students in our student focus group in person. We had another couple dozen, I believe, online. But the 2 students in Portland were students of color. And again, that was almost entirely what we talked about. So from a student perspective, it's clearly a significant issue for students of all backgrounds.
Great. So just in the interest of time, maybe we can move on to this question number 5. And Jim Irwin, I know this was an item that you wanted to make sure was included in this meeting. And what I understood to be the emphasis area was a discussion around the potential for a system level CEO advisory group for the chancellor. And this group could have some different responsibilities. It could be used to support and guide the system in setting and achieving priority outcomes. And it could be used to ensure the needs of Maine's employers are continuously brought to the table. Jim, do you want to say a few more words about that idea?
Well, I think you've captured the observation well. The suggestion that there be something at the system level is not meant to suggest that there aren't those kinds of relationships at the campus level, because I know that they exist. But what I think sort of over the period of time I've been involved with this, and I think for a long time before that, the system, and by that I mean I don't mean that, again, the chancellor's not divorced from the business community either, but what there doesn't seem to be, from my perception, is something that's kind of an institutionalized flow of information back and forth from the people who are most responsible, because of the businesses that they run, for driving the Maine economy and driving innovation in the Maine economy. And we need them in the room. They need to be partners with us, as opposed to kind of this sort of arm's length standoff relationship, so that they are fully supportive of what we're doing, because they know what we're doing is reflective of kind of a shared vision of what the state needs. And I think that's going to take some time to develop, but I think the way you started is by formalizing it, and that's why I think this should get some consideration.
Like, a question I have was, why wouldn't it be, because I think it's a really neat idea, and I like the deliberate engagement of CEOs. I wonder if it would be have even more of an implementation mode if it was a CEO advisory group that met, say, 3 times a year with the presidents and the chancellor, because I think that way you have that system level statewide balcony leadership, but also you have the presidents who can sort of hear directly from employers, not just in the regions where their campuses are, but around the state. So I wonder, because I think I always think greater conversation, particularly among those kinds of stakeholders, are important. I just wonder if it should be the presidents and the chancellor as an idea.
Yeah. I have some ambivalence about this, and I would echo Emily's concern. I think there's so much engagement, especially among the bigger campuses with CEOs already. And a lot of the smaller campuses, much of what they're producing are sort of public sector kinds of positions, and that's not necessarily a business CEO. But I think the place to begin might be to inventory what's currently going on at the campuses, particularly the bigger ones that have a lot of engagement with businesses. Look at their boards of visitors and sort of figure out what we're doing now and build from that rather than sort of create an overlay. And I think it buys into the bigger questions about what's the system's role, how do the campuses have autonomy, how much autonomy is too much autonomy, and I think it begs a bigger question. And until we answer some of those, it's hard to think about these system level advisory groups.
So one point I'll just add to this conversation, and certainly I hear, Trish, the point you're making as well as Jim's. I think if we think of the system as this body of universities, then I think that actually addresses Emily's point as well, that the leadership of these universities are involved in engaging with industry in the state. One of the things that has come up in a number of our conversations, and this is true across the US higher ed landscape, is the somewhat uncoordinated effort to engage with industry within the state. And so in part, this is about the actions of individual faculty. In part, it may be about, creating advisory boards. It's also to a certain extent about infrastructure and the way in which CRM systems are leveraged to create a more coordinated management of accounts, as we might think of it. And so in many of our conversations with university leadership, there has been, I think, an openness to and a recognition that greater coordination across the system in engaging with industry to create career pathways, to create greater awareness of the value of programs, the ROI that these universities are producing for the state and its industries. I think that there is something that can be cascaded across the system. I don't think it's a system office centric activity necessarily, but more of a system-wide coordination of effort that I think would benefit many.
To follow up on that, Peter, if I could, I think that we're talking about maybe two things that are related. What you just described is a very important, but fundamentally, it's system-wide, but really campus-driven development of relationships between faculty and particularly programs and the external entities and people that benefit from students who have been through these programs. So you create this constant flow of information back and forth between the institutions and the employers to make sure that the right things are being taught, the students are prepared, and as the market changes, the curriculum changes, that sort of thing. So that makes the sort of the relationships endemic at the campus and program level. What I'm thinking, this is meant to address a different issue, which is it's a more of a strategic advisory group for, and when I say the chancellor, it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to the chancellor, but it really is meant to be a strategic level advisory group to be looking at the future. And one of Maine's great problems is it is woefully low in investment, venture capital. I mean, way below, punching even way below its small weight in population. There just is not a lot of money flowing into the state to invest here. And one of the ways to fix that is to create, I think, in addition to having the R1 research designation for the University of Maine, and that's a huge first step. But then how does that get translated into more commercializable innovation, research and development, and into people actually investing their money here in order to realize that. And so the idea that really is to catalyze that kind of economic opportunity, which we're not good at in this state.
Peter,
Roger, please, and then we'll move on to the next topic.
well, I can't see everybody because of the screen, but if the chancellor's still here, I'd be interested in his thoughts.
So what I would say is, I'll share this with you. We've done a number of these road trips. And generally everywhere we go, there are complaints about the system and there are requests that we do more. The system hasn't been built with the infrastructure to take on a lot of new things without, quite frankly, deciding that you're going to spend a larger share of your money on systemness than individual university-ness. And I do think that two of our universities on this particular subject matter have fair amounts of infrastructure within their institutions devoted to this particular subject matter. Obviously, University of Maine, which over the last 20 months or so is experimenting with having a representation in the southern portion of the state to reinforce relationships that exist but may not have been polished to the same extent that they should have been. And USM, which is in the neighborhood of where more businesses are, but thinks it has a better relationship than it actually does with the business community. For instance, I've heard from the leader of one of our largest companies in the state that they don't want to hire in particular fields from that university versus another university in our constellation. So I guess I'll go back and repeat what I've said. Everybody complains about the system, but everybody wants it to do more. And it's an interesting juxtaposition that we find ourselves in. And today we're at Augusta, and people had lists of things that they think we should do for them. So I think finding the right balance and the right areas for us to, if we're going to build additional infrastructure, we have to decide that we're going to do it in certain areas because there just isn't enough. The pie is not big enough for us to keep increasing the slices, the size of the slice of the pie that we get, I suppose. Roger, those are some of my, my reactions to that. I think both the University of Maine, which is trying to step up its efforts in this particular area we're talking about, relationship with the corporate community, and Southern, which has stable leadership, and then Southern Maine, which this apparently from year to year is a higher level issue than a low level issue than a high level issue, even though they have infrastructure to support this outreach. It just hasn't done it to the extent that it could. Now, one excuse might be there is that they've put a lot more effort into fundraising than they previously did. And maybe they need to think about their fundraising and corporate relationship building in a more combined sense. Roger?
Thanks. Again, I don't want to, I know we need to move on, but Jim's specific idea of a CEO advisory group at this system level, I don't know if you've had a chance to think about that.
I have. I suppose my response to that, Roger, is that has not historically been a role for the chancellor, quite frankly. It's a touch and go from and quite frankly, the state's not the most inviting state in the world to have relationships with the corporate community. The Portland Chamber likes to isolate itself. The statewide chamber sees itself as playing a very specific role. If we're going to take this on, we're going to have to asset it. Quite frankly, is what I would say. So if you're asking me, do I want more responsibilities without assets? The answer is no. you guys, everyone hates the chancellor, but they all want him to do more.
One more meeting, right? Thank you. Thanks.
It strikes me that we're in the weeds a little bit, that there's a granularity to this that needs to be backburnered until we answer question 4. And I think there's a bigger discussion here about who does what and what problem this CEO advisory group solves. So I think it's really important, and I hear Jim loud and clear, but how to do it and how it plays on the existing efforts, I think needs more discussion at this level before we get into that level of granularity about the mechanisms to achieve goals.
Trish, could I just throw something out there? It may well be that with new leadership at Southern Maine, that a stronger relationship between the 2 largest universities might develop. And that may give rise to addressing this particular issue in a more unified way. But that has not, been possible over the last 6 years. So, and each of these universities have assets that they're devoting to this subject matter. Maine more than Southern Maine, but both substantially more than the combination of the other 25% of the institutions representing 25% of our population. So there are real possibilities for strengthening, but I think it's got to start with those 2 universities working more closely together.
And positioning about RU and how we collaborate or compete or whatever we're going to do.
Yeah, and Trish, I agree that a more robust conversation around question 4 and how that connects with question 5 would be really great, and that is definitely on our radar. And we're putting some, benchmarking together of how other system offices are governed, and we do plan to come back to you with some discussion about that in a future meeting.
Great.
So moving on to our second topic, I know we just have 7 minutes left. We have updated the data book with your feedback from our last meeting. And we have it's a growing data book with many slides. So we've highlighted the slides where there have been significant changes. And we are hoping to finalize this very soon. So any additional feedback offline that you would like to give us, we would welcome it. And then we do plan to sort of go live with the document. But for today's discussion, we've highlighted 4 areas that we have talked about in previous meetings as being very important to this group. And we've put some data behind these areas. And so what we have here is actually 4 discussion questions. 1 for community colleges, 1 for student migration, 1 on return on UMS education, and 1 on state appropriations. And what we have suggested for the executive session is that we would actually continue the dialogue from these 4 discussion questions. So I can introduce the very first one on community college, and this does connect to some of the areas that Roger was touching on before. But also, after I introduce this area, please feel free if there are any jumping, comments holistically about the data book that you'd like to add. Feel free to put those in the chat or let us know. But the thing we were able to find, I think the request last time was to do some research on the Maine community college system. And so we actually did find out that the Maine community college system has an average transfer rate of 21%. And this is below the national benchmark of the transfer rate to a 4-year institution from a community college of 31%. And then from connecting the dots from a few different data sources, we were able to find out that in fall of 2020, the Maine community college graduates who enrolled, of those who continued their education, 13% enrolled at a University of Maine institution. And so that data is represented on slide 16 of the data book. So an implication that we could draw for our strategic planning purposes is that actually a relatively small population of Maine community college graduates are transferring to a University of Maine institution. That said, we did feel it's important to note that a growing number of employers are comfortable seeking employees with less than a bachelor's degree if they have the appropriate skills. So that is something to just keep in the back of our minds. But we did think that it was worthy of conversation to explore how the University of Maine system executive leadership and board might work more closely with the Maine Community College system executive leadership and board to increase the number of students that transfer to the University of Maine system. Any thoughts on that question or in regard to the data that we were able to find after our conversation last time?
I have a question. I don't know if we have an answer for it, but what do we know about why the numbers are what they are? You allude to it in the sense that data suggests that there's a relatively small population and that a growing number of employers are willing to hire without that the bachelor's degree level credential. But that doesn't quite get at it doesn't get completely at the question of why the pathway doesn't look as attractive in Maine as it does in many other states. Because in order to address it, I think we have to have a better handle on what's not working.
Well, I would say it's been a minute since I mean, Mike Michaud is not on this call. He's on both boards, but it's been a minute since I looked at this data overall, but in my recollection, pulling from the back of my brain, it had more to do with programs, right? Like, right. And I think the getting into the question of what are the programs, like there's the general 2-year degree that sets you up to move to a 4-year degree or not in any variety of areas. And then there's the transfer programs like nursing, get a 2-year degree, moved. I would be interested. I think I appreciate the numbers here. I think they are definitely lower than national numbers, but I don't think we can answer the what do we do about it without understanding more what programs are transferring, what programs are not, what programs should be transferring that are at a lower rate than normal, and then understanding what the barriers are. I think that's the conversation we could have system to system about, and really talking to students is what are the barriers? Is the barrier cost? I don't know. Is the barrier navigating, credit transfers, right? Which is something we certainly have heard about, hence our move towards unified accreditation internally at the system, but system to system. I mean, that's, again, pulling from my back of my brain in my legislative days, that was a constant topic of conversation. But in my recollection, it had more to do with what are the programs and then what is navigating that transfer process look like, and also recognizing that a lot of students don't want or need a 4-year degree. They don't want to transfer, right? And we shouldn't push that on them.
So I have a couple of thoughts to share because we obviously have been working on this a while, and I feel like Janet Sorter, who's my counterpart at the community college system, and our staff and Rosa and Carolyn all have really good relationships. So it's not like we're devoid, and the chancellor works well with their chancellor. But we have studied this. There's a few things. First of all, just right out of the gate is we don't market like other states do. So community colleges will brand some of their programs as a starting point with connection points to the public institutions, bachelor's and master's degrees. So that's an area of opportunity we know. But it's more where Emily was going in her last part of her comments is the barriers. We have a few institutions, use Farmington as an example, where they just were not set up and did not care about that transfer population. And community college students tend to transfer close to home. You imagine that most of these folks are working, they have a tie to a community. That's why they were going to a community college in the first place. So they're staying put, and they're just going to move from one program to another, and it has to be proximity. And so you have a few of our institutions who either put up purposeful barriers in transfer articulation, recruitment disinterest, and all of those things, or like Farmington, their model is just completely broken with the 4 credit hour system. So we're trying to address all of those things as we find them. We're trying to have the conversations with the universities about core credit transfer, about how programs could be pipelined. And so Janet, we have a subcommittee with the community college that does work on pathways, is the way we're framing it here. But lots of opportunity to improve in this, as Huron's folk has pointed out, that not everyone is going to work out, but we should be closer to 31% than 13%.
I think we've lost Brenna and Kathy. I wonder if it's time for us to move on into executive session, or anything else on this topic before we do that.
Jim, I just could add one thing. Having hired a lot of people over the years from both the community college and from the university system, one of the trends that was driven by our business, and other businesses I'm sure are doing the same thing, we would often hire a community college graduate, had them come on board, and they would spend a year or two getting up to speed in a particular function, and then decide to go back to school because we would pay for it. And I'm not sure that the data would keep track of all that. So essentially they are going back in and getting a bachelor's degree, but they might be taking a year or two before they go back in. And the benefit is the company is paying for their education.
The Maine Development Foundation used to keep a lot of data on that too, about the employers who helped people go to college. Again, it's been a minute, but they used to do a fair amount of reporting and assistance to help employers build those programs that are excellent.
Yep.
Okay, Peter, anything else on this before we go into executive session?
No, nothing right now.
All right. I will then call for a motion to go into executive session, or the provisions of 1 MRSA 405-6A to discuss the evaluation of personnel, consideration, discussion of appointments. If I get the right, I don't think we're talking about that. I think it's 1 MRSA 405-6C to discuss condition acquisition of real property or economic development of premature disclosure of information would prejudice the competitive or bargaining position of UMS. So that's the basis for the executive session. Could I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Moved by trustee
Did you just do
Gardner.
that from memory, Jim Irwin? Did you just pull that from, it looked like you pulled that from memory, in which case that was very impressive.
I'd like to say that's true, but no. As many times as I've been through that. So it's moved by trustee Gardner. I didn't see who seconded.
It was me. Emily
Oh, it
Kane.
was. Seconded by Emily. Ellen, could you call the roll?
Certainly. Trustee King,
Yes.
trustee Ames,
Sorry, yes.
trustee Irwin,
Yes.
trustee Gardner,
Yes.
trustee Cates,
Yes.
trustee Riley.
Yes.
The motion is carried.